We've been talking about a lot of things the Catholic Church has introduced into the world. But how about the sanctity of life, the dignity of marriage? Let's talk about these things and a whole lot more today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last time we talked about Catholic charity and how important and impressive it is. Today we're going to talk about moral principles more generally. And we're going to find there's much in common in the two episodes. Because it's not as if we have some views on charity and then some views on morality and some views on this and some views on that. It all comes down to the same message. The idea that human life is sacred, and that each individual has a uniqueness and worth because he possesses an immortal soul, he possesses a rational nature, because he is made in the image and likeness of God. Now this is a revolutionary message. At the end of our segment last time, I pointed out that a lot of the religions in the Near East took the view that human behavior really wasn't all that important to the gods. I pointed out, for example, that the Sumerians were just at their wits' end as to what to do to appease their gods. Nothing seemed to appease them. And it so happened, of course, that they happened to live in a place that was particularly geographically vulnerable to floods that did not occur on any regular basis. So they tended to view the universe as a hostile place, governed by hostile gods who frankly were uninterested in their welfare. I gave the example of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks had gods who treated them arbitrarily and capriciously, weren't particularly keen on teaching them morality and good behavior. This seemed quite beside the point. The ancient Greek gods were often completely self-absorbed and narcissistic, nothing at all like the God of our own tradition. Well, it's no surprise, therefore, that in the Christian tradition, we believe that there are certain ways we should behave and that God wants us to do these things, that God cares about us. God actually cares how we treat each other. In these other religions, we see an emphasis on appeasing God through engaging in various kinds of ritual sacrifice. Now, it's true that for Catholics, we engage in the holy sacrifice of the Mass every day. But we also treat each other, are supposed to treat each other well, because that pleases God too. And that's something unique in the history of religions up to that point. This was something new in the world. And so the same religion that teaches you to give of yourself to others, to think about other people and their misfortunes, and to give in a way that's unselfish and in no way self-interested, that same religion, it should not surprise us, also teaches us important moral principles that follow from the idea of the sanctity of life. It's a single stream of thought. Now, how can we see these principles in practice? Look at the early church. What types of things do we see going on in the early church? What are the causes that people are taking up in their society? Well, of course, the early church gets its start during the period of the Roman Empire. And what do we see going on there? Well, among other things, we see the practice of infanticide taking place, literal infanticide. It isn't simply that the church went after abortion, which of course it did, but we see even a much worse situation. We have actual infants simply being left to die, and typically because they were the wrong sex. So you had many healthy female children simply exposed and abandoned. And we see the effects of this, by the way, because in the Roman Empire, men outnumbered women by 30%. There's that doctrine in play. But the Catholic Church moved to abolish that practice. But what we also note is that in the ancient world, there is no comparable teaching to what we see in the Catholic Church about the uniqueness of human life and its absolute sanctity. Now, it's true that the ancients did say that man had a dignity that surpassed that of other creatures, but they came nowhere near the Catholic belief in the sanctity of human life. We do not see that in the ancient world, even though we admire and respect the ancient world. Many of the early Christians looked with profound respect at the ancient world. They pointed to people like Plato and Aristotle as having anticipated some of the most sublime teachings of Christ himself, but at the same time they understood that there was much that was in fact to be deplored in the ancient world. For example, Plato, one of the most noble philosophers you can imagine in the ancient world, deeply admired by St. Augustine and others. On one occasion, Plato said that a man who is too sick to work should be left to die. It's impossible to imagine that in the Catholic Church. Now, what else is going on in ancient Rome, particularly? We see gladiatorial contests. That is to say, people are going and watching their fellow human beings try to kill each other, and this is a form of entertainment. Well, obviously, this is an unspeakable offense against the dignity of human life. And it trivializes human life, that someone's death would be something that we would want to be entertained by. So in fact, it was the Christian emperors who helped to abolish these gladiatorial contests, and that has been called one of the greatest moral victories in history. But it's not just that. It isn't just that we see examples of barbarism in the ancient world. Barbarism, by the way, that we're seeing, of course, coming up once again in our own time. We're also finding that there's a difference between the way the ancient Romans and Greeks treated the interaction of men and women and the ideal that we have for that. The ancient Greeks were utterly contemptuous of women, whereas in the Catholic faith, we see, in fact, a profound respect for women. And I realize this is the opposite of what people say. Supposedly, the Catholic Church is anti-woman, and it's pro-man, and it's patriarchal, and all the rest of it. But for heaven's sake, let's think about it. Where else in the ancient world, or even going up into the Middle Ages, where in the world could you see women who were able to run their own institutions? They ran their own convents and schools and orphanages, and so on and on. Where do you see that other than in the Catholic Church? We have a legion of female saints. We have tremendous devotion to the Blessed Mother. We have all these aspects of the faith that are pro-woman, and there are still others as well. And this is why, in the early church, it so happens that the Catholic religion was accused of being a woman's religion, because so many women belonged to it. So much for the idea that the church is an opponent of women. It was called a women's religion. Now, we see also an emphasis in the church on the dignity of marriage, that intimate relations between men and women were to be confined to the marital bond, such that even Edward Gibbon, some of you may know Edward Gibbon, was the historian in the 18th century who blamed the fall of Rome on the Christian religion. So he was not inclined to be sympathetic, but even he had to admit that in fact the Christians have helped to restore dignity to the marital bond. Likewise, the church taught what we might call the equalization of adultery. That is to say, it's not simply something to be deplored when a wife cheats on her husband, but it is equally to be deplored when a husband cheats on his wife. And Edward Westermarck, who was an expert in the history of Western marriage, has said that in fact it was the Christian religion that finally equalized adultery. So we have an emphasis on the equality when it comes to adultery, an emphasis on the sanctity of the marital bond. We have women in, to use a modern phrase, leadership roles. And in fact, incidentally, by equalizing adultery, in effect, the church is saying that men can't just get up and leave their wives, and leave them with nothing. So these things, in fact, attracted women. But it's more than even this. What else do we see with the Catholic Church's emphasis on the dignity of human life? Well, we see a campaign against even the practice of suicide.